What's his story from history that made you go, what the fuck? Agnes MacDonald, wife of the first Canadian Prime Minister, traveled with her husband out west after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. She was really excited to see the country. But to her dismay she couldn't see much from inside the train because the steam from the engine blocked the view. Her solution: they tied a chair to the cowcatcher on the front of the train and then tied her to the chair. She rode to British Columbia tied to the front of the train like a ship's figurehead. In ancient Egypt, servants were smeared with honey to attract flies away from the pharaoh. There was a samurai who was actually worried about how obsolete their system had become, and now that samurais were no longer needed in Japan, he decided to go to Korea and insult them so much that they would kill him, and thus the rest samurais would avenge him by going to war with Korea and proving their worth. People in the Middle Ages sentenced insects to exile after destroying crops. Xerxes I. He ordered to build a bridge across the Hellespont, and when it was nearly completed, a storm had destroyed the bridge. He got so pissed off that he ordered the soldiers to whip the sea 300 times for not complying with his plans. Edit. Apparently he also ordered for all the engineers who built the bridge to be beheaded before whipping the sea. Apparently in ancient Egypt the pharaoh would rub one out into the Nile in a ritual to make sure the fields would be fertile. Crassus, a Roman politician, is said to be one of the richest people in history. He had a number of endeavors, but one was real estate. He didn't buy property in the conventional sense. He formed a fire department to serve the city. When a fire broke out, he rushed there and asked if he could buy the property for its value. The owner usually would agree, because while they would lose their home, the fire department would put out the fire and they would keep their possessions. If they didn't agree, he just stood there and watched it burn. Once everything was destroyed, he would offer again, at a pittance of the original price. At one point he owned 1/3 of the real estate in the city of Rome. In about 1970 BC, when Rome was immensely wealthy, the military government of Myanmar built an entirely new capital in the middle of the jungle from scratch simply because their astrologer told them to. Terror eating a frickin' baby. At the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, the marathon was a total mess. The first place finisher did most of the race in a car. The guy in second almost died from eating rat poison. And the fourth place finisher raced in dress pants and shoes, and took a nap by the side of the road for part of the race. The most WTF history fact I know. Messy as well as comic. The Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI exhumed the corpse of one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus, and put it on trial. He had a deacon stand behind the cadaver and move its mouth and talk for it while Stephen charged Formosus with becoming pope illegally. When Formosus was declared guilty, the papal vestments were stripped off his rotting body. His blessing fingers were cut off, and he was buried in a graveyard for foreigners. He was then dug up again and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. His body was retrieved from the river and a later pope nullified the Cadaver Synod, and he is now buried in St. Peter's Basilica in his papal vestments. The cardinals who helped with the Cadaver Synod were excommunicated and they made a law that cadavers could not be put on trial. Then a later pope upheld Formosus' guilt and put a plaque on Stephen's tomb praising him for his Cadaver Synod. Edit. Changed successors to predecessors. Sorry about that. I also revisited this story on Wikipedia and found out that after being thrown into the Tiber, Formosus' body washed up on shore and started performing miracles. Local people rose up and imprisoned Stephen, and later strangled him to death for what he did to Formosus. Just makes an already fabulous story even wackier. Rather than use this power to rule or even conquer new lands, Nero still dreamed of being an artist. Cheered by an adoring public, he played the lyre, wrote poetry and sang. But Romans considered the idea of an emperor performing on stage as the ultimate disgrace. demonstrating a disrespectful and scandalous lack of dignity. Nero either didn't care or craved the adulation too much. He forced people to watch his performances without letting them leave. Which, Suetonius wrote, led some to pretend they had died so they would be carried out of the theater. Instead of admitting defeat, he chose his most British-looking soldiers. Mansa Musa was the richest man in history. He went on a pilgrimage and was so generous with his gold along the way that he destroyed economies of cities he passed through 4 years after with hyperinflation. Dude named Jack Churchill and his exploits. Frickin' nutcase in France during WW2. Last man to successfully use a bow and sword in war. Would charge enemies playing the bagpipes. Absolute badass. One time took out multiple German guards with a bow by the light of their cigarettes. The big thing in Victorian England was wallpaper which was dyed a certain shade of green. Green was considered to be a calming color. And this particular shade the most beautiful green in the world. It was used not only in wallpaper, but also to dye dresses, fake flowers for hats, and even confectionery. The dye was called Scheele's green, after its inventor. Its key ingredient? Arsenic. Yes. People were happily covering their walls in deadly poison. And quite a few people died as a result. Putting arsenic in wallpaper and other items was never banned by the government. It just fell out of fashion. This little excerpt from a story about a war between Maori tribes in New Zealand. When the men emerged in a weakened state, many of them jumped over the cliff to avoid the Waikato warriors. The fugitives were tracked down and killed anyway. Te Wairauero killed 150 prisoners with his favorite greenstone mirror, only stopping when his arm swelled up from overuse. A greenstone mirror is basically a club made of nephrite jade. King Henry VIII trying to conceive a boy. I'm sure most are familiar with the execution of the Romanov family, the immediate family, with the Tsar and Tsarina and all the kids. However, they didn't stop there. They really tried to get rid of all the Romanovs, including a princess turned literal nun who was thrown down a mine shaft, bombarded with grenades and eventually starved to death. In the 1500s the Czech would travel all the way across the Alps to exhume papal Rome's bodies and then bring them back. Dress them up in Czech robes, then put on display in churches. The accompanying paintings are absolutely lurid and beautiful at the same time. The exhumed bodies are holy now. HMS Dreadnought was designed to be the most modern battleship of the time. They still decided to put a ram on it, as other ships in history would often ram each other. Despite her guns being able to hit opponents at a much longer range than a ram would be useful at. She only sank one enemy vessel in WW1. A U-boat, which she rammed. It's the only time a battleship successfully destroyed an enemy submarine intentionally. Another little one. Admiral Hood was killed in a magazine explosion. Later, the HMS Hood was destroyed in a magazine explosion. Britain invaded China because they were wilted by our hero in the Opium Wars. When construction of the Great Pyramids began 500 years ago, there were still woolly mammoths living on Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia. Although, most woolly mammoths died out by 10,000 years ago. A small group of 500 to 1,000 survived there until 1650 BC. How the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the cause of WW1 and all the subsequent wars, was a result of bumbling assassins and a stupid stroke of luck. Long story short, after a failed attempt, one of the assassins, Princip, escapes to a restaurant to hide and eat in shame. Ferdinand was on his way to the hospital because his companions were injured in the explosive attempt. Ferdinand Drive makes a turn down the wrong street and the car stalls right in front of Princip. Princip then fatally shoots Ferdinand. TLDRA turn down the wrong street led to WW1. Edit. Thanks for the silver. Only thing I can think of are two stories from a book I listened to recently on WWII. Specifically from the siege of Leningrad. One dealt with an elderly woman living in the city who became so maddened by hunger that when she could find no food in her apartment, she went to her cupboards, took every dish and other eating vessel in her home, and broke them on the floor. Before scrounging through the debris in search of crumbs, the other involved young people, can't remember how old they were, who went out into the city in search of horse meat and witnessed a truck carrying a pile of bodies and body parts from the countless dead littering the streets, both from starvation and the German shelling. They heard a voice come from someone near the bottom of the pile, "I'm not dead. Please help me." Then the truck drove off. Edits, a few missing words added. It's got to be the 10th BCT stand in the Battle of Yao Tong Bridge. Basically 900 plus Filipino soldiers, cooks, medics and a chaplain were left abandoned against around 3,000 Chinese troops with propaganda proclaiming it to be 40,000. They weren't even forced out of the position at the end of the battle and actually lead a successful counter-attack to retrieve some of their forces before they were ordered to retreat. So yeah. What the frick? Imagine being the chaplain. A few minutes later you're doming a Chinese conscript with your 1911. When Ramesses II finally conquered this pesky nation, I'm sorry I forgot, he enslaved 10,000 of their soldiers, had them castrated, and when he was buried had them buried with him. He really held a grudge against them. More Soviets died during the Battle of Stalingrad than British and American servicemen did in all of World War II. The first president of Equatorial Guinea killed something like a fifth of his population because he was high. That time the Ottoman Empire raided the coast of Iceland in a reverse Viking move. I forgot which army, but the use of plague borders in catapults thrown over some castle walls as the first use of bioweapons. Pythagoras had a math cult that worshipped numbers. No children died in fires in Massachusetts in 2020. The first time in the state's history. Elizabeth Bathory was a countess from the 1600s who tortured, murdered a bunch of young girls and women and supposedly bathed in their blood because she believed it would give her eternal youth. They used umbrellas on sunny days in England to avoid getting hit by poop thrown out the windows back in the days. I forget her name, but some badass woman whom everyone was scared poopless of got an entire village to bring her 3 pigeons and 3 doves from each household. When she got the birds, her army tied bags with a flammable substance in them, lit them on fire. Then all of the birds were released at once. Their nest acted as kindling and burned the entire village down. Edit, this kind of blew up overnight. And some people responded that it was street Olga Kiev. Thanks to you, remove Kebabi and Utashkiira. Bat bombs in WWII. So ridiculous. I can't remember the name of the country, but I once heard a story about a country where when they needed to know if something was a good idea they would consider it while being sober and while being drunk. That up until the mid-60s in the UK, you could go to prison for attempted murder if you tried to commit suicide. I only found this out recently. It made me go, what the frick. Back then there was a punishment where they stick a spear up from your rear and it comes out your chest. It's in multiple different points in history that this punishment was used, but the reason it was used was messed up. For example, a woman who cheats on her husband can be staked immediately. There's also a story about a man being staked once and said to the soldier doing it to him that if he was going to do it he should do it properly. I don't know how the spearing was messed up, but the bigger question should be why he chose to have the soldier do it again.
Hi there. Look, if you enjoyed the video, well, why not go ahead and hit that like and subscribe to Reddit Stories. In fact, if you want to see even more responses to this thread, well then, take a look. There's the link in the description below. And remember, show some love to those authors while you're there. And I look forward to seeing you next time.